All right. Good morning. Hi, Chris. Some friendly faces coming in. Let's wait a few more minutes.
Looks like Ernie just disappeared into the river.
You went for a swim, huh?
The media would like, you're welcome to put on your videos. Not mandatory, but if you'd like to.
Nope, that's not good.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We're very excited for this discussion around Riesling with some of the most talented and iconic winemakers we have on the call today that really don't need any introduction, but we're very thankful for both Paul Hobbs and Ernie Loosen for being here today. A couple just housekeeping. Yeah, I see a round of applause happening. That's well deserved. Just some housekeeping. If you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll ask them throughout. We are recording the session so we can share it. And we will be doing any follow-up interviews if you have additional questions and would like to speak to either Paul or Ernie. But without further ado, I will turn it over to Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Education for Winebow, to take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. Really a privilege and an honor to speak to both of you and be playing in the middle of this conversation. It truly is a dream team conversation on Riesling, and that's what we're going to do. So, by the way, all of you should have the wines in front of you, and we encourage to taste throughout, but we're going to start with tasting and conversation around these things, and we're going to start with Paul. So you've had a global career. You chose to return to New York and focus on Riesling. What brought you back to the Finger Lakes?
Well, Ron, several reasons, but most importantly, start with the fact that I sort of like in my early years, Riesling was my go-to wine, and particularly German Riesling. And then as my career developed over time, I just thought, well, one day I want to see if there's a place in the Americas, whether it's north or south, that could compete with the Europeans. And that was a quest that really came into, let's say, fruition later in my career. And that sort of like was serendipitous in the fact that I was doing consulting work in Niagara-on-the-Lake region. And I guess I was getting reacquainted with cold climate viticulture. At the same time, people were approaching me from the Western New York area and Central New York area to do a project in the Finger Lakes. And actually, I was working with a French winemaker, and he said, "Well, you have better terroir there than we have in Ontario. You ought to go check it out." And I actually knew the area somewhat because my mother had was born in Ithaca, New York, at the base of Keuka Lake, and she met my father at Cornell University. And so we have that map. You might want to put that up, Michelle, because that's a good one to kind of help people understand where we're located. And I didn't think anything of it as a kid, of course, but there you have this layer, shale, both a combination of shale and slate that was deposited and formed under pressure during the Ice Age. So during the formation of the Great Lakes, these Finger Lakes were carved out. They're very deep and they're cold. And they reminded me a lot of the Mosel. And I had made several trips to the Mosel. I find it one of the most beautiful places in viticulture and maybe one of the most beautiful places on the planet. I didn't realize all the history of the Mosel. I kind of came to understand that a little bit later. But we didn't have the Romans to develop the vineyards here, as the Germans had the good fortune. At any rate, for that reason, and then my father, he's the one that really maybe, I'd say transformed my career choices because I was studying to be a medical doctor, but my father really wanted me to come back to the family farm in Niagara County and put a winery. And so that's why I went out to California and studied wine. So at any rate, part of this was to honor my parents. That's why it's called Hillick and Hobbs Estate. Part of it is to see if there's an area at least an area that resonated with me, that I felt that we could really go toe to toe with the best of Europe. And particularly when I say that, of course, I'm talking about Germany, Austria, Alsace, those kind of regions that are widely regarded as the best regions of the world for Riesling.
I think those are great reasons. And I think it's important as we taste your wine and we think about how it's expressing location, that when we think of the great wine regions of the world, that for Riesling, we have to remember that each of them is different. And so the Mosel doesn't taste like Alsace, and Alsace doesn't taste like Austria. And as we're tasting through both of these wines, they are reflective of location. And that's one of the magics. You spent years searching for the right site, and you kind of alluded to it. It's up on the screen now. What made Hillick and Hobbs location stand out to you? You mentioned slate and schist,
Yeah. And glacial
so
till, those are the main things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so because as I mentioned earlier a moment ago that the Mosel was sort of my reference, so I used the idea of the Mosel River. So where in the US did you have something that could be a body of water, for example, that would buffer the cold winters that New York has? And we needed that, otherwise we would lose the vines to winter kill.
Mm-hmm.
But also in addition to that, I needed a site that had enough slope to it to get good airflow through the canopies to keep the vines healthy. But not only that, it's important that, when it does rain, that the rain can get off the ground. And so in other words, you get the penetration you need, but it doesn't pool so that the feet of the vine stays dry. So that's the search that we began, which I believe is 2011 with my brother David, was to look for a site like that. And it took over 2 years actually of painstaking hunting to find this particular site. In fact, I'd almost given up in the year 2013. We were kind of like, I'm asking my brother, I think we're not going to find it, but we found at the very tip of the Finger Lakes where you had a sheer drop to the lake. And that gave the fall and the movement of air that I was looking for. And so you can see in this photo here, you can see that there's a lot of rock to get through.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, because of its layer cake formation, you can see how it fractures in the upper right-hand photo and the lower left-hand photo. But to get through it, we had to use this big machine that's in the right here to puncture the rock, shatter it, dig it out, and then put the grapevine, trim the roots, put the grapevine in, cover it up with some earth, and then cover it back up with rock. So this is a site that has to be, basically it's dry farmed, but it cannot be used herbicide. All has to be mowed and so on and so forth so as not to have any erosion. This was something in New York that had never happened before. And so the agricultural commissioner was very concerned about the way we were going to plant the rows here. And because I wanted to plant the rows up and down slope, all other vineyards in that region have been planted across the slope. But there was more of a risk of sedimentation, so we had to build quite an extensive terraces and settling ponds to make this high density planting work. In the lower left-hand corner, you see my brother David. He's the horse that actually really built this thing. And you can see the machine we used. Actually, it shows 3 teeth, but actually, that's the early years. That didn't work. It was too rocky, so we went down to 1 tooth. So every vine had to be punctured through this slate, hard slate. It shattered. And that was the way my German, this is, I'm sure a good friend of Dr. Loosen is Johannes Selbach, came and he's the one that, said, this is a good site. He took a piece of the rock and threw it down against another rock and shattered. He said, okay, this is good.
That's awesome. I hope everybody's tasting the wine. Paul, you want to say anything specifically about the wine as they have it in front of them? And then we'll have a question for Ernie.
Certainly. This is the 21 Hillick and Hobbs. So actually the first iterations were made in Virginia. We trucked the wine down to Virginia because we didn't have a facility to make our own wine. And we didn't have much production off the property. The overall property is 75 acres. we've planted 25 of the acres thus far. Currently there's 4 terraces that are planted, and these are clones. There's 4 separate clones they're all of German origin. They're all on rootstocks that are sort of the French American rootstocks. Some are very low or shallow rooters, and others are deeper rooters. So this particular wine is, well, the third commercial iteration. So it's still very young. The vines are quite young still. And one of the things we notice is that, for example, how much slower the vines grow here and gain girth, the trunk, for example. Yeah, it's amazing how skinny they are. I mean, if we were in California, that would be 3 or 4 times larger over the same period of time. They grow much more rapidly. So these soils and the climate are very limiting, so the vines really do struggle here. The wine itself is made in a very simple way. In fact, I was very curious when I was comparing notes with German producers of Riesling. I was thinking, well, they do this similar process as we use in California to make high quality Chardonnay. And of course, they made barrel fermented in neutral barrels or German rounds, but we just barrel fermented or tank fermented this in stainless steel. That's really all we had in the simplest of ways. Today we have large puncheons and a few German rounds. But basically, I had no idea this project would start with. I thought it was going to be not too expensive because the land was not very expensive, but it proved to be one of the most expensive vineyard developments that I've ever done. In this photo that you see here, the netting you see is for bird protection, but actually we don't really require much. But you also see drip lines, and we only use drip line on one rootstock. That's the Riparia Gloire, which is a shallow rooter. And we do not do any undervine management other than mowing. So we have what's called an intercepa mower that actually just kind of moves in and out. And so all this is mowed. The wine itself, I think reflects the terroir, the coolness of the site, the minerality of the soils, I think comes through in the wine. But you can see we can get the fruit right, but never more than 22 bricks. We never achieve more than 22. And normally the pH is, for those technocrats out there, around 3.1. So typically we hit about 12.5 alcohol. If we're maybe in a really warm season, we'll get to 12.7 alcohol. Fermentation is all native, and the yeast seem to give up. We don't know why, but after they reach about 3.5 to 4.5 grams, the fermentation shuts down. So the wine naturally has about, let's say, 4 grams of residual sugar. And that's pretty much the story.
It's a good story. It's a delicious wine. I'm enjoying the electric combination of the pH and that just twinge of sweetness to play with each other. So Ernie, they can definitely address the Appassionata wine now, but let's start with your family's been producing Riesling for generations in the Mosel. Now you're making Riesling here in the United States. What drew you to Oregon, and why is it the right time for Appassionata Riesling?
Well, I started Appassionata because I had been in Oregon, oh God, for decades. I think it was for first time I was in Oregon in the early 90s or so. Basically, I wanted to make Pinot Noir there, But I was also curious, basically, to learn what we could do with Riesling in Oregon, And how can we find, say, the best or the most interesting expression for Willamette Valley terroir for Riesling, And since for the last 20 years, you can say I have been on a global crusade to bring back the traditional dry style Riesling that was made in Germany at the turn of the century, because most people think that Germany always produced this fruity, sweet style Riesling, but that's not true. I mean, 150 years ago, that was more the dry style which was produced because they didn't have the technology. And in those days, the German Rieslings, by the way, had been the most expensive wines in the world around 1900. I had one, also a donkey years ago. I met from Barry Brothers, Simon Barry. He was in these days just becoming the head and the CEO, and he showed me old books, from between 1880 and 1918. And, you know, German Rieslings have been in these days 2 to 3 times more expensive as first growth clarets, you know. We would love to have these days back, you know. We have been then reviving this historical winemaking of my great-grandfather's time, you know, that was between 1880 and 1928, which means in these days, you know, I always say they had a lot of time, but no technology. Nowadays, we have no time, but therefore a lot of technology, you know, and this means they had a lot of patience in these days. And this is basically our GG reserve approach, what we do here in Germany, you know, which involves extended maturation in barrel and bottle. This makes dry Riesling very appealing to the consumers. And, you know, I'm making now GG reserve style Rieslings in the Mosel, in our own estate, which is 200 years in the family, in our Pfalz estate, which is Villa Wulf. In the Clare Valley, we have a joint venture together with Peter Barry of Jim Barry, where we do a GG reserve style wine, which is called Walter. Then in Washington State, as we all know, together with Chateau Saint Michel, and now also in the Willamette Valley, you know. And my hope is that this dry style of wine, you know, will bring people back to the greatness of Riesling, you know. That is basically my goal, you know.
It's a great goal. I'd love to see it as well. For selfish reasons, being a huge Riesling fan, it's nice to share it with people and have them appreciate it. But I think your comment about extended time in large oak and on lees, making it more palatable to consumer, is a great place to throw this in, because it's a cornerstone of Appassionata. So talk about how it sets Riesling apart and why that makes a distinct point of difference when you taste wines like that. And obviously this one is an example, so the crowd can taste along as you're talking.
Well, you know, the extended lees contact, it gives the wine time first to develop, you know, the balance and harmony, you know. And the lees maintain a reductive environment in the barrel, you know, which inhibits oxidation and improves ageability, you know, because as long as you have the full lees there and no batonnage, the reductive environment works against the micro-oxidation to the stage, you know. We don't allow malo. That was never a tradition, neither here in Germany and with Riesling, you know, because we want to keep the acidity, which is basically the backbone of Riesling and is also very vital for the aging, you know. And so I always say, if people ask me, you know, what is so interesting? What is the, you know, what makes Riesling so great? I always say acidity, 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 you know, and that is, and malo would destroy it, you know. An extended maturation in the barrel and in the bottle, you know, it's not only in the barrel, you know, allows the acidity, you know, to integrate into the complexity of the wine, you know, becomes, you know, and makes, especially we in the Mosel as a northern growing area, which always, I mean, had been, you know, always on the fringe with the acidity, you know. I mean, we needed this long aging on the lees, you know, the micro-oxidation, but to keep it in balance and leave it as long as possible in the barrel to integrate this acidity, which can be, as a young wine, a little bit, say a bit too astringent, you know, or too pointed, the acidity, to integrate it into the, you know, into the whole complexity of the wine. And that is basically the whole idea in the old days, you know. And properly matured wines show the signature of the terroir also much more precisely as young wine. We see it very, very much the way with the extended maturation, you know, allows, you know, to the primary fruit and the fermentation aromas to fade, you know, because this is not the terroir, the primary aromas. This is fermentation aromas, you know, and so the fruit, and so where the people always talk about, but this is going away, you know. And as soon the tertiary aromas, my grandfather always said, don't touch a Riesling, drink it, vintage plus 10, then you should start drinking it, because then the wine is finished, then it has, developed the tertiary aromas, and the real beauty of the vineyard and the wine will emerge then,
Yeah, and I also love how it adds texture to the wines
Yeah.
through the course of time, and how they become more lush and mouthfilling because of that. The razor sharpness of the wine is now not dulled, but added to. And I just want to comment on side by side on both of your behalfs. These wines are really beautiful examples of exactly what Riesling is supposed to express. Paul's is that fresh, vibrant, I'm ready to age, but you can drink me right now, razor sharp with the beautiful citrus and malic tones around it. And then yours is showing all of those characters that you're looking for with putting it in barrel with leaves for a while, texture. You've got some of the tertiary, secondary leaning towards tertiary aromas coming through. It's really cool to taste these two side by side with two completely different intentions, two completely different places, but both very, very Riesling based wines. And that kind of brings me to you, Ernie, on this beginning question of the great wines of the world. You touched on this. When you think about the great wines of the world, what qualities set Riesling apart in your mind, other than acidity? Because we've already got
that one. Without question, for me, Riesling is a noble white wine variety. It is far more interesting aromatically, for me at least, and structurally, than grapes like Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. I don't want to discredit, Chardonnay. I love also Chardonnays, but the Rieslings for me are much more interesting grape variety, and by its very nature, Riesling has a potential to produce great wines, depending where it is grown and the skill of the winemaker, sure, but Riesling and Pinot Noir, they really show terroir, and that's a cool climate grape, and that's the reason Pinot Noir people love Riesling, and Riesling people love Pinot Noir, for my opinion. It's always, for me, that's the reason that I also do Pinot Noir there. It is the red and the white twin for me always, and it's and in its very nature, Riesling has the potential to produce great wines, absolutely. For me, a wine cannot be described as a truly grape unless it hasn't the potential to age, I mean, a wine can't age, I mean, for me, we love to drink old wines, not only old Rieslings, and we know Riesling can age very well and get very old, the oldest Riesling I had in my mouth was from 1900, and but the great wine need the potential to age, otherwise I can also go to Aldi, and buy a $2.99, and drink it immediately. I don't expect to put this away. But great wines you want to put away because you want to see the development, And Riesling belongs to the great wines, which has, as a white wine, with red wines we know it, but as a white wine, one of the few grape varieties which has this great ageability, because of its acid structure, Riesling can age much longer than most other varietals, like Pinot Noir, as I said, has Riesling the ability to evolve slowly, over decades even, becoming a much deeper and more complex wine as it matures.
And everybody on this, probably everybody in the audience, everybody, certainly the three of us, unmistakably love Riesling. But Paul, what about the obstacles that there's something holding back the everyday average wine drinker from Riesling? And, what do you think is about these wines that can bridge that gap? And what do you think is holding them back?
Yeah, Ron, I think Ernie sort of touched on that. In fact, frankly, I think at least for the last several years, when people go to the market and they see Riesling, they're not really sure what they're going to get. It may say dry, but it drinks sweet. And so I think some of the problem has just simply been nomenclature and causing confusion in the marketplace. So I'm really a champion of what Ernie is talking about with respect to making dry Rieslings, because I think that's basically what people want to have. It doesn't mean it has to be absolutely bone dry, but the perception of sugar or sweetness shouldn't be there. For the most part, of course, there should be some of those wines, but with a nomenclature making clear the word dry. We were debating what this was the other night in Yerevan, Armenia,
Mhm.
Where did that word come from? And I hypothesized that it probably came from British dry humor. But I think the word dry means that it's just straightforward. It's more serious, and it pairs up better with most the way we dine today, the kind of food that we're eating today. So I think if people are a little afraid of Riesling, because the other day, for example, I was in um, Florida, and a lady came into the space and said, it was like a reception for a lot of people, and the first wine that was offered was Riesling, and she said, "No, I don't drink Riesling." By the end of the evening, she was a super fan.
Hmm.
We just had to get it in her mouth,
Right.
but her perception, her preconception had it all like, "No, that's no good. It's sweet. I'm not going to drink it." And so we're going to have to get over that hurdle.
Yeah,
But I
we're
think that's
definitely.
the mission that Ernie for sure has been on, and now I'm finally joining in the mission. So I'm happy to be part of your team, Ernie.
Yeah, we all need to be on Ernie's team for sure. Yes, I totally agree. Showing them usually makes the difference, especially in the dry styles. Paul, what must a Riesling have or be for you to call it world class? And how are Finger Lakes wines achieving this?
Yeah, well, I think again, Ernie has pretty much hit the nail on the head with that ageability. And he said, his father told him, you know, it's now plus 10. Don't even touch it until it's 10 years old. And we
Mhm.
know that the élevage, what happens in the bottle, is something exceptional. You miss a lot of the depth, the beauty, and the complexity of a Riesling if you consume it in its youth. However, it has to be made well. It cannot be just like Liefermilch. I mean, it has to be a good one. And so, but when you get that, you get something that, in fact, I do also agree, hardly if any other white variety can showcase terroir in the way Riesling can, given time in the bottle. The challenge with Riesling also, I think I want to just point out in this area, is that it's more fickle in terms of where you can grow it. In other words, Chardonnay can be actually grown in a wide variety of terroirs, but Riesling is quite site specific and has very specific, and that's what took me so long looking for a site to plant. I mean, I've never spent 2 years hunting for a vineyard, but that's what it required to get, to do what we're doing. And then, of course, you know how it is. You don't know if you've hit the je ne sais quoi without more time invested. So I'm still waiting. Like Ernie's got all this experience, but I'm still like this is a 19. It's only halfway to 10 years old.
Yeah, it's drinking great though. Ernie, in past conversations and in this conversation, you pointed to Pinot Noir of Willamette Valley motivating you to invest there. At what point did Riesling of the Valley demand your attention?
Well, the opportunity to produce a Riesling at Appassionata basically came in 2015 when we leased the Medici vineyard because we didn't had any access to Riesling before that. And the Medici is one of the older vineyards in the Shale Mountains, planted in '76. And, I mean, Oregon is a fairly young wine growing region, especially in comparison to Europe. I think the whole thing started in '65 with David Lett and so '76 is old for this area. And I think it should be I think it's even the oldest Riesling vineyard in the Shale Mountains. And it's also on uncrafted wines, which is, still rare. Um, but most of the vineyard is Pinot Noir. It's about 20 acres, of Pinot Noir, but 4 acres are Riesling. And that is just, enough to fill a barrel. And we have this kind of volcanic soil in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, what they call this Jory or the volcanic weathered clay, which is extremely similar, really very similar to a vineyard which we own, because it's also here in the Mosel. We have only one village, which is Ernstiger Würzgarten, which has nearly the same soil, and therefore we do have this great experience with this soil. It was super interesting for me to see what we can do with with the Riesling there, because especially this kind of winemaking which we use, works, we see performs best here in the Mosel with the volcanic soil as with the slate soil. That was basically the vineyard of my grandfather from my father's side.
Yeah, I was thinking of that as we were leading into this conversation about having stood there in Erzgebirgsgarten with you and thinking of the similarities of the volcanic soil. And then when Paul was talking about a few minutes ago about how thin, narrow diameter the vines are, how slow they grow in New York, I was thinking of the 100-plus-year-old vines in the Mosel that are also, just about this big. And I'm like, those are 100 years old. Are you kidding me? But it makes sense, right? It's cold there. So this is for both of you. Why don't we start with Paul? In 2 sentences or less, tell the world why people should explore more Riesling.
Oh, you put the onus on me with the 2 sentences. Okay.
It rarely works out, but we're trying anyway.
Well, I think the world should explore Riesling simply because it does truly reflect place, and I think that's something important in wine, unlike many other beverages or consumables. Riesling is one of the best, if not the best, white wine, and even as Ernie has pointed out, stands shoulder to shoulder with showcasing terroir, and that's an interesting thing because then you can go from site to site and say, wow, you can make that connection. So, but it's outright delicious. I mean, and it can be made in many different forms. So that's why the world should pay attention. We just have to help the world understand.
Absolutely. Ernie, now to you. Your 2 sentences.
I mean, Riesling is for me the greatest white wine, in the world, without doubt, It's versatile, it's diverse, it's complex, and completely delicious, And, the same thing you have been asking, I have been preaching that message for more than 30 years. And serious wine lovers, get it, We have no problem with the serious wine lovers, with all the journalists, I mean, Jensis is preaching since 30 years, but even she said she gave up. But we're still working toward the day when more casual wine drinkers will discover the greatness of the Riesling,
Yeah,
But
I
this
hope for it
might be also, might be when you ask, what is it? Why the people, we have been talking about dryness or not dryness. I think because possibly what makes Riesling so great, the versatility, makes it so difficult for the average consumer to understand Riesling. Because, and you have a Chardonnay, it's dry, okay? You have 2 options, unoaked or oaked, But with Riesling, you have so many options, from dry to medium dry to a sweeter, lighter style, all the way to noble sweet, and so many things, and then that makes it might be confusing the average consumer, but for the freaks, for the wine freaks, that's lovely to, I mean, Riesling, you can learn so much about it, and so from that point of view, might be, but I always say that people should learn about it, instead that we give up all these wonderful style of Rieslings we can produce.
Yeah, don't give them up. That's for sure.
You don't want to give
But
it up.
Ron, I think kind of the more apropos question, maybe I'm preempting your question. I don't mean to do that, but I'm going to just jump in and say, I think one of the problems, again, is back to perception. And in my mind, when I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, you had these cheap Rieslings coming over from Germany, leaf from Ilch and so on. And I think that actually helped bring awareness, but then at some point it went the other way in terms of, oh, these are just cheap white wines, and damaged the really beautiful wines that Germany and Austria are known for, and what the variety is known for. And I think that's what this lady in Florida was remembering. It's like, that's Riesling. And that's sort of like what Yellowtail did for the Australian category, that kind of thing. Or what Merlot did when it exploded in the Napa, Sonoma, and particularly in Napa area, where there was so much demand and people were so greedy as winemakers. Well, we weren't growing enough grapes, so they started blending other things and dumbing it down. And then all it took was a straw to break the camel's back, like a movie Sideways, to kind of like, bam, do in the category.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're fighting against is a perception. And maybe we have an opportunity, particularly with the younger generations, because they don't necessarily have that negative perception.
Yeah, I think we definitely have an opportunity with them because of the desire for lighter, brighter, fresher wines. Riesling is
Yep.
all that in
More
all the
crunchiness, more
styles.
minerality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that as we're communicating these things from the sommelier to the guest perspective, I'm usually trying to find out what kind of texture they like, right? And Riesling is a very direct wine very often, especially dry. And so I need to find out, do you need a mouth-filling wine? Because if so, I might have to find you something else. But because consumers in general, I find that they really are specific about the textures they love. But I have a dream one day. Maybe I should do this together because we can do it uh, all Riesling beginning to end meal with all the styles, sparkling through, Trockenbeeren Auslese and pair it with all different kinds of food.
Oh, that'd be a mind blower.
Fun, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, I'm ready.
Three people would show up, but we'd be happy people.
You got three right here.
That's right.
Ron, we have a question from the audience from Kenny. Kenny, would you like to ask live or would you like us to read it? Let's see if I can unmute him.
I'm happy to ask it live.
Perfect.
This is for Ernie mostly, but Paul, feel free to chime in. I'm curious, Ernie, how lees create a reductive environment. I mean, at a biochemical level, what's happening to promote?
Yeah, because therefore that we don't do batonnage. That is one of the reasons. If you do batonnage, you kill the yeast. But still, we let them after the fermentation, the yeast sinks down to the bottom, and we don't touch them. We only sulfur, then top up the barrel, and let them sit on the full yeast. And as long the yeast are alive, because yeast need they create a reductive environment because on air then they die, and that is the reason they it's reductive. And young wines, most people don't know it, but the stinkiness what our Rieslings often had when they had been fermented after fermentation, this is this reductive stink, because they produce this reductive environment, and that goes slowly away through oxidation, but if you enhance by, for example, with if you do batonnage, then you kill the yeast, and then the reductive environment goes away, and then you have more oxidation through the staves. That is pretty, because it's an anaerobe. Yeast is anaerobe, and I can't explain it now so much in the chemical side,
If I may echo some of what Ernie just said, Kenny. First of all, a lot of people don't even know what the word reductive means because it's reductive or oxidative, right? So reductive meaning the lack of oxygen. And the yeast, when the cell wall of the yeast breaks down, it releases enzymatics or enzymes that absorb oxygen. So one of the purposes of batonnage, for example, is to help accelerate that process so as to release the autolysates, what we call yeast autolysates, or Vegemite, if you're an Australian.
Yeah.
That's what absorbs the oxygen. They consume, those enzymes can absorb the oxygen. That's why we can delay the addition of sulfur dioxide or not add it at all. Those are, that's really the whole point. So what Ernie is saying, if I understand you correctly, Ernie, is you're not doing batonnage, but you are creating a reductive environment. But within
leaving it
within the barrel.
Leaving it
one
alive.
last point here. Within the barrel, the upper part of the barrel, if you're not mixing it, is going to be more oxidative than the lower part that's near the yeast, because the yeast are going to absorb all that oxygen, consume it.
But it consumes it out of the whole, of the whole barrel, not only down there, because it is consuming it. Yeah, because yeast.
They do, but as you know, Ernie, we've measured the redox potential at different levels in the barrel, and it's if you're not doing batonnage, near the bunghole at the top is where there's most oxygen. So it's most oxidative environment.
Does the shape of the barrel influence this out of natural
Absolutely.
circulation? Like how the wine
Yes.
kind of moves around?
Well, if you have what's called Brownian motion, which is something that Einstein kind of was one of the first to to elucidate this concept of Brownian motion, then you do have some natural mixing that occurs. But the majority of activity is in the lees base, which typically in a fermenter occupies 2.5% of the volume of the fermenter.
Okay. Fascinating. Lots of technical stuff. Techno geeks
Yes.
unite. I love it.
Now, Kenny asked the question.
Yes, good question too.
Kenny, did you have any follow-up? I see you had a few questions in the chat. Was everything answered?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. I was also going to ask you, Ernie, you talked about inhibiting mallow. How are you inhibiting mallow? Are you temperature? Are you sulfuring?
Because I told you, after wine is fermented dry, we sulfur, you know? And as soon as you sulfur the wine, no mallow anymore, you know?
Yeah.
Because that's the reason you can't, if you want to have mallow, you shouldn't sulfur the wine, you know? That is in Burgundy. They wait until the mallow is done and then they sulfur, you know? Because as soon the wine is sulfured, you can't, then the mallow is, not anymore possible.
Yeah. But Ernie, I have a question for you. Because even in New York, where it's quite cold when we harvest is late September or early October, and we're fermenting in steel, not in barrels, because barrels you'd have more population of bacteria, right? We sometimes see spontaneous. I'm sorry?
If you keep them clean.
No, but we're not.
Wine crystals.
We have some malolactic occurring, can start during the fermentation. So.
Well, yeah, but even
have you
you said 3 to 3.1 is the pH, yeah?
Yes.
Unusual usually. Then that
I know.
With higher pH, you can have the mallow already during the fermentation, but with 3.1, it's usually a low pH where mallow doesn't really, usually doesn't.
That's why I thought you might have some secrets for me that I could. I don't, because I was shocked the first time it happened.
Oh, really?
And the fruit is sound. It's sound fruit. It's not like it's coming in with. So anyway,
are there
it's something that we never go to completion, but we may consume 50% of the malate before the fermentation is finished, and we shut down the fermentation.
Interesting. Are there any?
We'll chill it or add a little SO2, which, as you know, shuts down the bacteria but allows the yeast to continue to work.
So I have a question about the bacteria. Is there a variation in local bacteria that does mallow like there is in local yeast?
You know what? That's something.
I don't know.
That's something that to spurn some new studies, because there very well could be. Yes.
Wonder.
Could be hardier bacteria in New York than there is in Oregon. I don't know.
Could be.
We have another question from the audience. Christina, would you like to ask live?
Sure. My question is, have either of you considered screw cap as a closure, as many of the top Clare Valley Riesling producers have so heartily championed?
Well, I don't have anything against screw cap. We do screw cap, with certain wines, But I think, to be frank, it is not a solution for all wines, especially if we're coming again to reductivity, We saw often, you have really to check the wine, But we had bottled wines under screw cap, and they have been going really, really reductive in the bottle, because that is the other thing, if the wine is finished, like I was once when we had this down under Riesling seminar or convention, and we have been talking about that too, and then some of the Australian winemakers, the old world people said, yeah, but this is a bit of a problem if you have wines which are already reductive in the barrel, and then you bottle it under Stelvin, then it goes even worse, in the bottle. And then all the Australians said, oh, that's not a problem, you dump some copper on it and then it's done, sure. You can do this, but, that's the reason they have no reductivity in the bottles, because they fine everything. But we don't do any fining here with our GG Reserve, no fining, no filtration and nothing. So then a cork can still be helpful if the wine needs a bit, it's tiny of oxidation, tiny bit of oxidation, So from that point of view, I'm not against Stelvin, but you have to check on the wine, if it is suitable for Stelvin or not,
You're
Paul,
Yeah, from
reminding
my
me,
side,
Ernie,
Christina.
I was
Oh, sorry.
actually at that Riesling conference in Melbourne about
Oh,
seven,
yeah.
8 years
Yeah.
ago. And now you're talking about it. I'm like, yes, you were there and actually discussed the same thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Australia, it's impossible, because we do a wine together with Peter Barry, and
Yes.
he said, no problem, you can do a wine here, and my boy is doing a wine in the Mosel. And I said, okay, they can do whatever they like here in the Mosel, but I want to have the saying with Australian wine, and I want to go on cork, And so it was all good, 2 years in the barrel, and then we came to the bottling, and it's closer it came, Oh, then first Sam, one of the sons, phoned me and said, "Oh, Ernst, you really want to go under cork, we are here in Australia." I said, "But we discussed it so often, I think we should go." And I sent already the bottles and the corks over there. And then a week later, his younger brother phoned me and said, "Oh, Ernst, you really want to go under cork?" And so, I said, "What's wrong with you guys? I mean, that is not a devil, I mean." And then a week later, the father phoned me and said, "Oh, we can't go. We are Australians. We can't go back to Cork. It's absolutely impossible." I said, "Yeah, but I sent already, but the bottling is already going. I mean, we in 3-4 days. I sent the bottles. I sent the Cork. How should we get now bottles?" And oh, they already had it already there. They never had been take. I don't know what they are so frightened about corks. I don't know. And I sent only tested corks, because you can buy now tested corks where every single cork is tested. So it is not an argument anymore. But I mean, I totally understand that they use the argument that it's true in the late 90s, the cork industry did a lousy job, that they had a lot of cork tainted wines. And so this is not an argument anymore if you buy the tested corks, I don't know. It has becomes a philosophy with them or whatever. I don't know.
Especially in
Paul,
the Clare. That's the heart of
Oh
screw
yeah, oh
cap
my God, these
country.
guys. Anyway,
Paul,
Well,
your take on this?
we
The
have
only
one.
the only
Oh, go ahead.
comment that I would have on that is simply that it's a question of perception. I think when people work with screw cap, they think it's a less expensive wine, a less serious wine. So the great wines are under cork, and I think and then there's the ritual, of course, that people and we say, well, to some that doesn't matter, but I think to many buyers it does. It's sort of like tradition. I don't really have a problem with screw cap at all for even the greatest wines, in terms of functionality, because they're designed today to breathe, just like a cork, and so you can get what you want. And we can make in fact, great reds, and they won't go reductive either under a Stelvin or a screw cap that has the right permeability built into it. So it's just a question if the image. It's an image thing, and it's more than anything.
All right, Michelle, you were jumping in, I think.
Yes, we had one pre-submitted question that I think would be great to end on. It is, you both have extensive experience working in winemaking regions around the world. What was one moment that surprised you with working in Riesling in the Finger Lakes and Willamette Valley? And what was one moment in the vineyard or the cellar that best represents that moment when you thought this could be a world-renowned winemaking region for Riesling?
Well,
Paul,
I'll
would you
lead
like
off
to
on that.
start? Yeah.
Sure, I'll lead off. So I have so many, I just choose one because Ernie is a true specialist. He's got generations of history built into his genes, and so I'm a newcomer in a sense to growing Riesling relative to Ernie for sure. So, but when you go into a new region, you're going to have the wives' tales or the folklore of the region. People are going to come and tell you what you can do and what you can't do, and so on and so forth. And to some degree, you really want to listen to that. Well, the example I want to give is with the vineyard, and I'm just going to use, we're in an area that I wanted to make it sort of in a rain shadow, if you know what I mean. In other words, New York can get quite a lot of rainfall during the growing season, which is typically concerning if basically you dilute the fruit too much or you have too much growth. And so I was quite concerned about that. So I looked for an area that would be more, would see basically less rain. And in fact, we did such a good job that we actually had some drought situations. And that's why you may have noticed there was a drip line in the vineyard, particularly on the shallow rooters. But what really happened that surprised me was that we were going through this drought period, and then we got rain. And I've never seen this before happen to grapes, but the roots uptook the water so quickly, so rapidly, they split almost 30% of the berries. So we were thinking, here's the rain as our savior, and it's actually split the berries, and we lost a third of the crop that was already a very light crop. And that particular wine is 2020. And then, of course, some of that had the botrytis infection, caused the botrytis infection. So we had all those kind of complications. So now that's a learning experience saying, well, you've got to keep enough water on the rootstock so that the feeder roots, when they do get water, are not so greedy that they suck it up so quick that they actually burst the fruit.
Wow.
That's one example. I can give you many more. We could spend hours on learnings.
Ernie, do you have any thoughts to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be frank, I have been thinking the whole time, because as I said, for decades I have been in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, knew a lot of producers, saw a lot of Rieslings too. We didn't grow our own Rieslings, but a little bit the same with Australia. It was a style of Riesling which didn't impress me much, And I thought possibly it is either, ignorance, or either they don't know what to do with it, and so, but that's the reason I have this crusade about the dry wine and this old winemaking, because I saw with this kind of, I mean, I tell you, when we did the first Appassionata Riesling 2016 in this style, it was such a different, animal, and it was really, I mean, we saw it every time when we tasted it out of the barrel, it came better together, it was not this, this astringency, of acidity, and I don't know, that was never come together, and I thought, this old winemaking of my grandgrandfather, because it was wines as they had been possibly 100 years ago with us, high acidity, but astringent, didn't came together really, if you don't give them the wines time enough, that's all about the time, giving the wine time that they find their, I mean, naturally their balance, and so, and yeast is a very, very, very important, factor in wine aging, It is basically the best natural fining agent too, You don't need fining. You have your yeast. That's the best fining agent in the world, And so, but you have to give it time. And even with the first vintage, going this way, was amazing. And then I said, okay, then, I mean, I know in the US, people want to have everything immediately out, I said, okay, even after 2 years in the barrel, we will give it another 4 years in the bottle. That makes it even better again, I mean, okay.
Yeah.
We had this banker from Silicon Valley. He didn't understand it at all, He said, no, you have to sell it immediately, you have to bottle it earlier, immediately, And so, but if you want to make great wines with ageability, you have to give the wines the time too, And that was my biggest experience, when I started this also, because I didn't know if it works or not, but it worked. It worked great. It works also in clear. I mean, unbelievable. It's a totally different animal, So much more harmonious, And then the people like also dry wines, because the problem in the old days with the dry Riesling, and I totally understand that the consumer didn't like it, they wanted the sweeter style, They had been austere, acidic, and not harmonious, because the people have been going away from this traditional style of winemaking for the dry wines, It works with fruity style wines very well. The beautiful fruity cabinet, we all know, we love it, It's a great, zipper, on the patio, As my grandmother said, it's a wonderful wine to drink yourself sober with 7.5%, 8% alcohol, you know. She could drink like hell, this, my grandmother. These old ladies, they could pray and drink.
Well, thank you so much. If there's any further questions, I'd be happy to follow up those questions to both Paul and Ernie to get those answered. But I want to thank everyone for their time today. And Ron, thank you for hosting. And Ernie and Paul, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'd like to add one more thing when we go back to this topic, if I may.
Oh, please. Yes.
Yeah, when we go back to the topic of ageability, one of the reasons I want to point out, and I think Ernie touched on it, but I just want to sort of emphasize his point, is that low pH confers ageability. And if you think about Chardonnay, normally most top quality Chardonnays are going to be bottled around 3.3 at the low end to 3.5 or even higher. But Riesling is normally much lower in pH. And so that's one of the reasons it can last and last and last, which makes it extremely interesting because you can watch its evolution over time. I mean, it may seem absurd to say, oh, I'm going to buy 6 bottles of Riesling and taste them every 5 years, you know, but that's actually, I got a number of my cellar from Ernie that I'm doing that with. And it's amazing what you get that's something really interesting to see. The other thing I just wanted to mention again, because, you know, everybody's concerned about, you know, what they put in their body and how they're drinking and so on and so forth, and lower alcohol. And these wines are just naturally lower in alcohol. I mean, as I mentioned, we break at full maturity in late September, and if we get to 21.5 bricks, we're happy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, you're getting 12% alcohol naturally. There's nothing you have to worry about there. It's 12.5%. So you can really, to Ernie's, was it your mother, your grandmother? You know, to her point, you can drink up and really enjoy it. And so, you know, what my professors taught me as a graduate student is that you take a little bite of food, a little sip of wine to refresh the palate, and you can do that with Riesling all day long. And also, I think it just crosses so many food barriers or so many food lines. I mean, I think all these things, we just need to get that message out there. And the last point, we do now wine tastings with our California portfolio or our Argentine portfolio, and always we bring a Riesling to sort of like, I can't tell you how many times, it's almost shocking how many times the consumers or the attendees that come to those tastings will tell us the best wine of the night is the Riesling.
America is on its upswing. I have recent memory, vivid
Growing
memory,
awareness.
yeah, of that. And also the realities of if the ageability of a wine is an indication of the greatness of the grape in the region. I have vivid memories of well-aged Finger Lakes Rieslings that were just brilliant. I have a last week, 2011 Michigan-based Riesling, brilliant. Willamette Valley wines, 15 plus years in the last year and a half, brilliant. So we have a real possibility here in the U.S. to make great Riesling, and you two are doing a great job. And I was so privileged to sit in the middle of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ernie. It's great to be with a legend.
Thank you, everybody.
I'm the lucky guy. I'm the lucky guy here.
Oh, that's me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.